So walk us through ABM and its future in relation to modeling human behavior. And where does that rest? Is there any value? Obviously, I believe there's a lot of value, but what's going to be the opportunities that can be taken advantage of using this technology for modeling human behavior?
Yeah, so a few things before getting into it, because human behavior is incredibly complex, changes all the time, and there's a whole host of stuff we probably don't know about, right? But the way to make sense of all this is the word prediction. I think one of the things that I've moved away from fundamentally is this idea of one perfect prediction. I don't know how it's never been that useful because it's just one, it's too hard. And I think the better way to think about this is, hey, I think we get comfortable with a range of possibilities, right? Hey, this can happen, that can happen, and we are prepared for those eventualities, right? As opposed to whether it is exactly 10.2 percentage versus 100 point whatever, that's less of the point. I think it's more of that. And a lot of the work we do, a lot of the things we do, they are never that precise anyway. And so I think it's fundamentally empowering to think about different possibilities and preparing for those. Like, hey, what can I do to actually make this happen? And driving things like that. Now, from a risk perspective, that's a really good way to think about it. Now, if you think about our hedge fund days and risk and stuff like that, it's a curve. We try and say, hey, there's a probability of everything, but you don't plan like that, right? You plan of, like, say, hey, if this scenario happens, I think I know what to do. If this scenario happens, I think I know what to do, and so on and so forth. And that's where Taleb and a lot of these folks have gone, right? Which is like, hey, it's very hard to model this as a curve, but sometimes you think of these massive discrete events, and have you created your life, your company, your organization in such a way that you can actually address that if it were to happen. And that's a lot more empowering way of thinking about it. So going back to human behavior, I think that's the first paradigm. I don't know if we'll ever be able to model perfect human behavior, but I think what we can get at pretty reasonably is, hey, this may happen, that may happen from a human behavior, or something may happen. So for example, if something terrible were to happen, there may be a scenario of mass migration that may happen.
Yeah.
Or there may be a lot of deaths or something like that. Or maybe there is this massive innovation that solves everything, right? And then you say, okay, again, how am I positioned best to adapt to all those scenarios? And that's sort of how I think about it. But fundamentally, human, unfortunately or fortunately, I think that's where the science has been very, very wonky, because the math behind it isn't perfect. That fundamental math of how do you think about humans has to evolve. And it hasn't been the case because, again, a lot of our focus has been top-down sort of statistics where you can make the entire sort of variability of humans go away. Because on an average, yes, human beings behave in a certain way. Stock markets always say that, right? People will keep making the same mistakes every 20 years as you go along. True, but I think we need to get down to a lot more of a fundamental understanding of how humans work.
So one of the areas that scientists don't like to venture into is things like consciousness or values and principles and how they drive certain behavior. I think it's exciting, though, because if what we're saying is that if you're looking for a certain outcome and you're being driven by certain principles and values, and it could create a certain outcome, that becomes very powerful because you can then see how certain businesses or technologies or things that you want to prevent or things you want to create, you can take base level ideas to then drive how the behavior is going to be to see what possibilities could be created in the future. And what's also interesting is that if you take it as a snapshot from point to point, so say for instance, we'll do a Miss American pageant. I want to solve all of poverty. So if I'm going to go about solving all poverty, and I've got these principles and values, I want to end world hunger. Bill Gates just came out with a book on climate change and how to make that impact. And I've got all these different values that, whether it's today's zeitgeist embraces or something that I, from my past, have said, hey, these are things that are important to me. How would you then take that approach of principles and values to drive certain outcomes and use agent-based modeling? Because I think that, at least from a personal standpoint, that's where it becomes real.
Yeah.
Where it's like, hey, this isn't just another model of what's going on or what has gone on. can be used as a tool to actually drive decisions and create futures, and also understand the ramifications of them as well. So how would you approach building a model based upon principles and values to drive certain outcomes, like, say, ending poverty or something like that, or starvation or hunger or whatever?
So there are a couple of things. One, I mean, even if I reflect back on the books we've read, right, if you look at Tony Robbins and stuff like that, I think there's a lot of foundational understanding, or at least hypothesis, in terms of how values and behaviors and all these things that people have can create these long-term outcomes for them, right? There is a fundamental thing. If you think about civilizations, they've been founded on things like value. Now, it's complicated when you have to say, hey, value, what's going to happen on day 1 versus day 2 versus day 3, but over time, we know values and systems like that have created some massive things in this world, including civilizations, companies, countries, and so on and so forth, right? And oftentimes the conflicts that we see are sort of the difference in values and things like that, right? So to me, there at a broad level, there are already some foundational things available to start thinking about values and the impact of it. And I think a lot of scientists are starting to now look into that, because one, I think with science, it needs to be measurable. And how do you measure values? It starts with something as fundamental as that. How do you quantify the thing, right? Because I think I agree with a lot of what people said. Hey, if you can't quantify it, how do you know it's real? You don't know if it's, if you can't quantify it, it doesn't even exist. I would disagree. And I think we need to get comfortable with the idea there may be some things we can't quantify, but we'll still need to think about it. Because they are important, like values and things like that. And as parents, we know that inherently, right? You and I probably can't quantify what kind of value and what does it mean, but we know when it exists and when it doesn't exist, right? So there's something to it. And let me circle back to that point. I want to say something else, and then I'll come back to sort of the eventual question you asked me. The idea of creating a future once you have an agent-based model, there's a parallel I want to give, which I think is instructive. Like this was a time, early 1990s, and the promise of internet was, hey, the information will be available to every single person at that instant, which means, the volatility in the market will go away because everybody knows it, and everybody will converge towards a certain way of thinking because facts are going to rule the world and stuff like that. It doesn't. And that's one of the things we may need to be open to, where when we actually solve this idea of information and prediction and things like that, let's not forget there are humans with different motives. Everybody is self-serving. And so when we all have this amazing technology, I may use it for a different purpose than you, and you may not be able to predict that because everybody's average technology quotient has gone up, right? So I think some of the fundamental problems will probably still continue to exist just because humans are self-serving, and we may want to solve poverty, but we may have different values and we'll do it in different ways.
Yeah.
And God forbid it clashes. At that point, nobody's going to, one of us is not going to create its future, or both of us will fail at that point. So in some ways, yes, it can be used as a model to do it. But I think at any point we have to realize technology is for everybody. Everybody's technology quotient goes up. And they all have individual interests in how they'll want to use technology. And that will drive the ultimate sort of
So that's also a factor. Is it self-serving from an individual or potentially a group?
Sure.
Because that's the great thing with ABM, is that it's the interaction between agents within the environment, not necessarily the individual within the environment. Now, you can do that, but it doesn't make as much sense. And that's where I think how the zeitgeist of, say, the United States is very interesting, where if you look at, I don't watch the news. I read the newspaper. I talk about this, I don't know how many years I've been doing it now. But what I understand is you have a large percentage of the U.S. population that's watching, say, Fox News versus MSNBC or whatever channel. And so you create a collective consciousness around certain principles and values. And this topic of echo chamber has come up several times, where you have a belief, you have an idea, you have a value or principles, and so you like all these things on all these different social media platforms, and it feeds yourself what you already want. Now, on one side, from a marketing standpoint, that's fantastic, because then you can get to the customer who wants your product or service more effectively, and then identify from a segmentation standpoint who I should be creating what marketing channels to sell what products to. On the flip side, it also creates this massive negative effect because you're not able to introduce new information and ideas to the system. and so it becomes more and more insular. Now, this isn't new. Everybody, I don't know, everybody always feels like this is the first time any of this stuff has ever happened, but it's been happening forever. So walk us through, how can you simulate the behavior if there's like an echo chamber? And then also, how do you add in chaos into that environment or new ideas that may conflict with the perspective, principles, and values you have, so you can have more of an open-minded dialogue and conversation about very controversial topics. Yeah. Now, I don't even start into that. I'm pretty PC about most things, but it is very disconcerting, generally speaking, because it's one thing in the United States, it's a whole different ballgame in certain other countries. Yeah. Where we said echo chamber, you're not allowed to have other thoughts, and so the elimination of thoughts and ideas becomes kind of a thesis for certain countries and policies and dictatorships and organizations. Where is the balance? What can ABM do to create that creativity within a system that seems very insular?